Today on the Nathan Jacobs Podcast, we have something out of the ordinary for you. My recent lecture here at an event in Middle Tennessee on Nicene Trinitarianism. What is it? We'll find out today on the Nathan Jacobs Podcast.
Before I jump in, one of the things that is on the way, it's in development and pre-production right now, is a series on East-West differences in theology. And so I wish I had a trailer here to show you that, but you can go check that out at theeastwestseries.com. That's theeastwestseries.com. And you can pre-order the series today, which helps, as Tim said, support these sorts of endeavors that I'm doing. It's also the cheapest price. If you're interested in that, it's a 25-part lecture series, and it's currently at the cheapest price you're ever going to get it. So there you go. If you're interested in that, check out the eastwestseries.com. And I will be touching on some East-West differences here tonight. So that's the relevance. All right. So Tom asked me this evening to speak on the doctrine of the Trinity, and specifically on Nicene Trinitarianism, and we'll talk a bit tonight about what exactly that means. So the doctrine of the Trinity is one of the few doctrines that you can say is ubiquitous across all traditions. Now, I know there are some outliers. Tom could probably name one, but there are. But for the most part, it is one of the few doctrines that you find Roman Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, and various brands of Protestants all saying that, yes, we believe in the Trinity. And equally ubiquitous is the basic understanding of what that means. The average person who says, yes, I believe in the Trinity, and you said, okay, so what is the Trinity? They would name Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. They'd probably say three persons of one nature or one essence or one God or something like that. They would offer something along those lines. And so the formulation, that basic formulation, is also rather ubiquitous. Now, the other sentiment that is also sort of surprisingly ubiquitous is the idea that it is beyond explanation, right? So this is something that happens quite often when folks are like, well, that's the doctrine. It's a mystery. We don't know. We can't really explain it. If you try to explain it, you'll fall into heresy. So it's best to just sort of affirm it and then move on. And so this sort of inexplicable condition, right? This notion that somehow it is inexplicable comes out oftentimes if you ask people about analogies. So when I would teach historical theology, I would always ask students when I got the doctrine of the Trinity, I said, all right, so what are some explanations you've heard? And some of the common analogies that would come up would be, there's the H2O explanation, right? Well, we have this one, well, I guess it would be compound, but we have this one compound, H2O, and it can be a solid or liquid or a gas, right? And then I'd be like, okay, that's okay. Any others that you've heard? And normally then somebody else would throw up their hand and they'd say, yes, an egg. I heard an egg. It's got a yolk, and it's got, it's got the white, and it's got a shell, but it's one egg. It's like, okay, all right. Any others? And then they would say, well, there's the guy who is a husband to somebody, and he's the son of somebody else, and maybe he's the father to somebody else. So he's like one guy, but there are these three different roles that he plays. And inevitably, when I would teach on this and we'd gather all the analogies, and there'd be variations on these, all these different analogies have different variations on them, I would always have the delight of telling them, well, all of these are ancient heresies. and so I'd walk through, H2O, that's Sabellianism, right? This idea that somehow you have one guy who puts on these three different masks, but there's only one guy behind it, right? The egg one is actually kind of difficult because nobody believed that God, being a spirit, had parts. So this sort of composite notion was not really something that you would find. But the closest you find is tritheism by John the Grammarian, who talks about, like, he uses like this lump of clay that you cut up into three parts. That's the closest thing you get to something like that. And then you have, again, another sort of form of what is essentially Sabellianism, where you have one guy who has just several roles to play, different names for the same guy. And so, everybody would chuckle. That's funny. We all believe in heresies. That's great. And then what would happen inevitably would be they'd be like, yeah, but Dr. Jacobs, like they're all heresies because it's a mystery and there is no way of explaining it and there is no analogy for it, and so on and so forth. And one of the things that's interesting about this is that it leaves people with this impression that the Trinity is this thing that you absolutely must affirm, but you don't even know what you're affirming. So it's like this awkward relative that wanders into the house at a Christmas party. You've got a freedom, but you hope you can exit that conversation pretty quick because nobody really wants to hang around and talk. It's an enigma to hang out there. And so the question, of course, is that true? Is that right? Is the Trinity somehow beyond understanding, beyond explanation? Is it just some sort of, well, we believe in three, we believe in one, and now we're silent because if we say anything more, we've wandered into heresy? And the answer is no. Historically speaking, the answer is certainly no. So the problem with this reply is that one of the things that it presumes is that all analogies are equally false, that any sort of analogical language inevitably is false language. Now, the reason that's a problem is that all language about God is analogical, historically speaking. Everything you might say about God is powerful. Yeah. Trump is powerful. Right? That's an analogy. God is wise, right? Solomon is wise. That's an analogy. You don't mean the same thing when you use those words. And so you're sort of stuck at this fork in the road regarding language. And let me just point out one more thing before I say what that fork is, which is that even the heresies are analogies. So Sabellianism is one such ancient heresy about the Trinity, one that I already mentioned. And the analogy is that you have one guy with several faces or masks. So he's like an actor who shows up and he's got one persona. Now he's got a different persona. Now he's got a different persona. That's an analogy, and it's a heretical analogy. And so analogies don't get you off the hook for truth and falsehood in the ancient world. The choice you really have here theologically is to say all language about God is analogical. When we talk about wisdom, when we talk about power, when we talk about presence, right, whatever it is. And therefore, it's all false and meaningless. And therefore, well, you either go toward fideism, we can't know anything about God, or religious pluralism. All the religions are just saying different analogical things that aren't meaningful, but behind it all, there's some transcendent something that none of us could reach. Or the alternative is to say that analogical language can be true and it can be false. And historically speaking, Christianity has always been committed to the idea that your analogical talk about God is true or false. If I said God is a shepherd, the Lord is my shepherd, that's an analogy. If I said the Lord is a thief, it's a cheat, that would be a blasphemous analogy. And one is true and one is false. So not all analogies are created equal. Analogies can be true or false. And so the question is, when we're talking about the Trinity, do we have any way of understanding what's actually being said in something like, say, the Nicene Creed? Okay. Now, I think the best approach whenever we're talking this way and we're exploring a doctrine like this is to begin with the things that can be said positively. Okay, what can be said analogically, positively? I'll give you one such example. Christ is begotten, right? He is the only begotten. Well, begetting is an analogy, and we'll actually talk about that particular analogy. So you begin by talking about the thing that we understand, right? We have some sense of what power is. We have some sense of what presence is. We have some sense of what wisdom is. And then after we have a grasp on what's being said positively, then we offer the negations or the qualifications. Now, what we're not saying is this, right? The Lord is my shepherd. We're saying things about him, leading me beside the still waters and protecting me and caring for my soul. We're not saying he smells like sheep. Okay, so we need to go ahead and say what is true about the analogy and what is false. And I think that is the best way to approach it. And this goes to two different ways of talking about God. Cataphatic, positive things, you say, true, affirmative things, and apophatic, negative things. God is not finite, right? For example, right? So that's going to be our approach here tonight. All right, so when talking about Nicene Trinitarianism, okay, so the term Nicene Trinitarianism, this of course refers to the Council of Nicaea, which is the first of the 7 ecumenical councils of the first millennium, held in 325 AD. Now, this is the council, and by ecumenical council, in case people aren't familiar with this, throughout the early church, you can see it already in the book of Acts, you have church authorities gathered together to discuss some sort of dispute or question that they have, and they come to a conclusion, what seems good to us and to the Holy Spirit, if you're going to, cite Acts, or in the ecumenical councils, this is the faith we receive. So there's some sort of dispute, and they're asking a question. We're hearing two different things. Arius is telling us one thing, Athanasius is telling us another. What is the faith that we received? And council is deciding that. Now, you had all throughout the first millennium, you had local council synods and things like that. But every now and then a controversy got so big and so dangerous to the empire that you really needed to pull together the entire church. And that's representatives from the eastern part of the Roman Empire, representatives from the western part of the Roman Empire, in order to adjudicate this issue. And that happened 7 times in the first millennium. So those are the 7 ecumenical councils. And the first 2 of those are about the Trinity. They talk about other things too. But those first 2 are where we get the doctrine of the Trinity as we talk about it today. The way that I talked about it when I said 3 persons, 1 substance. We'll get back to those terms. But those first 2, and that's why this is called Nicene Trinitarianism. Now, it should technically be called Nicene Constantinopolitan Trinitarianism, but nobody wants to say that because it's really hard to say and really cumbersome. So it's just shortened to Nicene Trinitarianism. And the most significant figures when talking about these first 2 ecumenical councils are largely figures who would be classified as Eastern Church Fathers. Some of the main folks are people like Athanasius of Alexandria. In this first dispute for the first ecumenical council, it's Athanasius versus Arius. Another character who isn't often named as much as Athanasius, but should be, is Alexander of Alexandria, who's also heavily involved in that. And then after that, in preparation for Constantinople, leading up to and then in Constantinople, the Cappadocians. And so this is typically the big 3 that people name: Basil of Caesarea, Gregory of Nyssa, those 2 are brothers, by the way, and Gregory of Nazianzus. And there are other Cappadocians, like Nicaea, their sister, brilliant. But typically when people mean the Cappadocians, they mean those 3, the 2 Gregorys and Basil. So when we're talking about these things tonight, we can get into any sort of weeds you want as we go through this. Tom has asked me to try to avoid the weeds as much as possible. We'll see if we succeed. But I live in the weeds. I set up a house. I built a mansion in the weeds, a mansion of ideas, Tom, and truth. All right. So let's start with this basic formulation, right? The basics, as I said, that most, the average person, this is a surprisingly common bit of knowledge, is that we're talking about 3 persons and then 1, and here what's said after the 1 is always different, right? Some people say 1 God. That's actually not a translation of the term. Oftentimes people will say something like 1 substance or 1 essence or 1 nature. And those are all actually interchangeable synonyms, and we'll talk about that in a second. The Greek terms here, and forgive any typos on these slides. I tried a new interface between a new device I had and AI in terms of pulling in text and things like that, and it did pretty good. But there's some typos in here. I could see just scrolling through. But the terms are 3 hypostases and 1 ousia. Okay, so those are the Greek terms. Now the question is, of course, what do these terms mean? What does it mean to talk about a person or a hypostasis? What does it mean to talk about a substance or an essence or nature or ousia? Now, in the basic, most general sense, and I'm going to start with this. This is where I had said I wanted to start. I think the best place to begin with what's easily grasped. And then you begin to add the qualifiers where it gets a little more elusive, right? The more qualifiers get added. The basic distinction here is between a common nature identified by a general noun. So Tim is human, Lila is human, Tom is human, right? That's a general noun. If we had if we were at a horse ranch and I'd look and, I'd say, oh, that's a horse, that's a horse, that's a horse, right? The species term, the general noun, that's what an ousia is. A hypostasis is the subject identified by name. So I just did that when I said Tim and I said Tom and I said Lila, or we said Seabiscuit, and I'm not really good on horse names. So, two other.
Muffin and sweet cigar.
Right. What they said, right? By a nose and, I don't know. I'm not, I need some betting people. Tim, surely, plenty of it.
Poker name.
Right. Oh, right. Not horse racing. I got it. So that's the basics that you're talking about. When you identify the type of thing or the species of thing, these three are dog, right? These three are horse. These three are human. That's ousia. And then when you identify the name, Tim, Tom, Lila, Grant, whatever it is, now you're talking about the hypostasis. And so when you look at somebody like Gregory of Nyssa, and he's using an example this is, for example, in his letter on three gods, he uses the analogy of Paul, Timothy, and Silvanus. Oh, well, another transcription error. It's Paul, Timothy, and Silvanus. That's what it is. Apparently AI was thinking, you don't want Timothy. You want Peter and Paul there. Well, but that would work too. Paul, Timothy, and Silvanus, and the nature of these three who are identified by name are human. Now, I realize that the moment somebody hears that for the first time, they say, whoa, whoa, whoa. That sounds like three gods. Sure does. That's why Gregory wrote the letter on not three gods in order to address that. But what's telling about that letter is that he's responding to somebody named Pelagius. And Pelagius asked Gregory this question, do we believe in three gods? And the reason he asked that question is because he said, I know what these words mean. They mean the common nature and the subject identified by name. And when I see Paul, Timothy, and Silvanus, I see three humans. So do we believe in three gods? Now, Gregory will address that question. We'll get back to that question later on in the presentation. But the important thing to understand is the very fact that that question is being asked. That's being asked because that's what those terms mean. Okay, so that is the proper way of understanding the terms being used by these Greek writers at this point. Okay. So let's go into the background of why these terms and how this formulation begins. The initial dispute within Nicaea between Athanasius and Arius was a question about whether or not the Son of God is of the same nature as the Father. Now, I think for the average person who's heard about this discussion, if you've ever heard of the Arian dispute, you recognize that the Arian dispute is about whether or not Jesus is God, right? Whether or not the Son of God is God, right? And yet, the specifics of the dispute are actually more philosophically robust than that. I'll come back to that in a second. But the two positions that were represented here was Athanasius, who is saying, yes, they have the same nature, homoousia, right? Same nature. And Arius was saying, no, they're similar in nature, but they're not the same. He's very godlike, similar, but he's not the same nature as his Father, right? And that's homoousia. Now, the philosophical background, all of this is something that's called realism, right? And so realism takes the position that the general nouns that we utilize, like dog or cat or circle or square, all these sorts of general nouns that we throw around when we look into the world are real, right? And so now you might think, well, of course they're real. I'm looking at a room full of, real things. I mean, what do you mean? Of course they're real. Well, here's the question, right? You and I and every other rational being in the world, we look out into the world and we immediately, upon being capable of asking a question, begin to think in general nouns, right? You take a kid to a zoo and they ask, what is that, right? They're asking, what species of thing is that? Not asking who, right? They're asking what it is. What is that? And so we think in these general nouns: human, right? Bipedal, round, four-sided, right? That's what we think of. And the question of realism is saying, why does the mind do that? The mind does it. All of us do it. Can't stop doing it. But the question is, are we in just sort of haphazard, chaotic matter? And the mind just needs to organize a bunch of stuff, so it invents groups to just help process and organize our experiences? Or is the mind identifying structures that are real out there in the world? There really are such things as human. You all share something in common, human nature. That's the question. And realism was committed to the idea that the reason the mind thinks that way is because that's how the world is. It's actually structured that way. Okay? Now, the reason that's important is because the question that's being asked here about saying, does the Father and the Son, are they of the same substance or nature or essence, is like asking, is Tim and Tom of the same substance or essence, right? And if you're a realist, you say, yes, they are. They're both human, right? And that's exactly what Athanasius is saying. He's saying, yes, the Father and the Son, they are the same type of thing. God, they're the same type of thing. They're not saying the same person, the same type of thing, just like Tim and Tom are the same type of thing. Whereas Arius is saying, no, two different species of thing. One's really godlike, but, no. And that is the question of the council. And of course, the council in the Nicene Creed sides with Athanasius, that the Son is of the same nature as his Father. Okay. So yes, the Son is of the same nature as the Father. Now, there are several reasons for this, and I'm not going to go through all the different reasons here because that's not really, what this is about. We're not defending Nicene Trinitarianism tonight or something like that. The Son is the only begotten of the Father. And this is language that was one of the reasons why the Church Fathers insisted, people like Athanasius insisted, that they have to have a continuity of nature. When it comes to beginning, right? What is the word beginning? Well, the beginning, you come across it a lot in the Bible. Abraham begot Isaac, Isaac begot Jacob, Jacob begot his 12 sons, right? All those long genealogies that you skip over and don't read, that's begat, 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 right? And so they know what it is. It is when one subject paternally generates a second of the same time. And when that happens, there is continuity of nature. If Grant announced to us, hey, everybody, Lila's pregnant, and we all said, whoa, yeah, all right. What is it? Right? I'll drink to that. We said, what is it? And Grant said, I don't know. I mean, I personally, I'd love a horse, but I know it's going to be a rough birth. So, I mean, maybe a dog, a hat. I mean, if we could do with a hat. Henry would be like, man, 86 Grant, he's had too much to drink. Because obviously humans beget humans, dogs beget dogs, cats beget cats, and God begets God. And with that, one of the things that you see is that even though language of sonship appears all throughout the Bible, right? The angels are called sons of God, for example. He is the only begotten Son of God. Right. So all these other sonships are analogical. They're adopted sonships or something like that. He's the only one who is begotten, generated of the very same nature as his Father. And so it requires a continuity. And here, there's an important aside that I want to note before I move past this point, because this is really the point of Nicaea, right? Nicaea wants to say that the Son is of the same nature as his Father. He's his only begotten. That's why there is continuity of nature. The Father gave to the Son in his generation his own nature. one of the things that, again, sometimes happens out of an interest of saying, out of this impression that says the Trinity cannot be understood. You cannot understand it, so don't try to understand it. And if you think you understand it, you're a heretic. You'll find people saying things like that. Is that there's a tendency, well, that must be true for God, but not for us. But here's the thing. It's very important to the church fathers, especially the Eastern church fathers, who are the primary ones in this discussion, that it's true for you and me as well. That Tom and Tim really do share the same nature. And we'll come back to Gregory's answer about the, see, there it is, Paul Timothy Sylvanus on this slide. We'll come back to Gregory's answer on the polytheism question, right? But one of the things that Gregory says when asked, when a Pelagius wants to know, like I see, Mike and Tom and Tim, and I say 3 humans. And Gregory says, I know you do. You really shouldn't. And he says that's a very sloppy and imprecise way of speaking. I know you're not a metaphysician, and that happens with non-metaphysicians, but it's not true. What you see here, because human is a species term and there's only one type of thing, is you see 3 human, singular, persons, plural. The number of subjects having that nature are several, but the nature is not. Right? And so Gregory says that's a common abuse of language. And we'll talk about that in a second. Now, the reason I bring that up, the reason it's so important to them that that's true not only for the Trinity, right, that there's a common nature, but also for us, is because in their mind, the gospel itself hangs on this point, because Christ took on our nature to heal and redeem it. He is one of us because of the incarnation. And so it's very important to understand we're not talking about some odd metaphysical point having to do with God that doesn't apply to you and me. It's very important to say there's one human in this room. And if Christ were in here, there'd still be one human in this room. Right? I shouldn't say if he was bodily in our presence right here, right? We see him. All right. I think, did I have, no, that's right. Okay. Now, let's talk about what happens in the wake of Nicaea. So you have this established, right? We know what ousia means. It means the common nature. Got it. We got it. All right. And we know that the persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, have a common nature. Good. We're solid. But are we? Because what happened was a lot of confusion in language. And the confusion was actually because of the number of synonyms in Greek. Okay. So I had mentioned at the outset that the terms used for substance or nature or essence, which these are all interchangeable, by the way, the nature, the essence, the substance, those are all different terms for the same thing, right? The common nature. I said that the terms were ousia and hypostasis, right? Ousia being the common nature, hypostasis being the subject. That is true by Constantinople. That's not true at Nicaea. At Nicaea, those are still synonyms. Hypostasis and ousia can both be used. They can be used for an individual. They can be used for a nature. They can be used for a genus. And so they were wildly ambiguous, which is why in Aristotle's writings, he'll distinguish primary from secondary substance, so you know which one he's talking about. If he's using this term, he's like, well, I mean the primary substance, meaning the individual Tim. Secondary substance, I mean his nature. They had to append a predicate to it. But the Eastern Church Fathers go ahead and they're like, we're changing the Greek language. And they did this actually a lot. This happens a lot in the church where they're like, there's a confusion. We need to fix the language so that people understand what's happening. From this point on, and we have the letter where Basil of Caesarea talks about this. He's like, there's a real problem. Some people are walking around talking about one ousia, and some are talking about 3 ousiae, and some people are talking about 1 hypostasis, and some people are talking about 3 hypostases, and nobody knows what anybody's talking about, and we got to fix that. So from now on, we only ever use hypostasis for the subject and ousia for the nature. We don't use them interchangeably anymore, right? And this is important because in Nicaea, there's actually an anathema that condemns anybody who says there's 3 hypostases, even though that's what the Constantinople would say. But that's because it uses it 3 ousiae or 3 hypostases. It's using it as a synonym for ousia back then. And so at this point, they're going to go ahead and they're going to say, from now on, ousia just means the nature. Hypostasis just means the subject. Okay. So we've got that. Now, why did they pick? If you're going to pick, right? There's all sorts of different words. You could use phusis too, right? We could throw in more. There's other options here that we could utilize. Why pick hypostasis? Well, there's two good reasons for this. One is Origen. And so Origen, in combating the Sabellians, had already started using hypostasis to say, no, the persons are real or substantive, right? So remember what Sabellianism is. There's one guy that we call God, and he puts on three different masks. It shows up in play acts as the Father this time, and shows up in play acts as the Son this time, and as the Spirit this time. And Origen had said, no, they are three substantive realities. They're not mere faces or masks or personae. And so that was one reason. Origen had already used it to establish this point. And then the second reason was for etymological reasons, having to do with what hypostasis is, which brings us to our next point. So the first place where this is really hashed out in detail, most scholars would acknowledge that Basil's Epistle 38, or what's in Basil's corpus as Epistle 38. It's disputed. Maybe Gregory of Nyssa wrote it. There's attribution to both. But this Epistle 38 is the first place where hypostasis is used in the way that Trinitarians use it, is explained. So it's an important letter. And what do we find here? So what's interesting is what we find well, actually, I have, before I jump into what do we find, let me first say what we don't find. Okay. Oftentimes people will raise the question of, three persons, and then they go, and what is a person, really? I mean, Tim, what is a person? I mean, is it love? Is it relationships? What is it that really makes a person a person? And you get that sort of like vague talk, like it's an undefined term, which Tim's already vomiting as I talk like that. The other thing you have is this lingering sense that a person is a center of consciousness. And this is a very modernist notion, right? The Cartesian notion, René Descartes, I think, therefore I am, the idea of personhood primarily being thought of as just the thinking rational part of the self. And so oftentimes when people hear the word person in our modern context, they think of these sorts of things. They either think of something very rationalist, right? Or they think of something very ambiguous, right? And the problem is you don't really find that. And this is one of the reasons why I don't actually like using the word person as a translation. There's two reasons for that. First of all, that the closer Greek equivalent would be prosopon, not hypostasis. And that's the word used by the Sabellians. So I really don't like person as the preferred term, but it's common parlance. I think subject would be, a subject, or there's reasons I don't use individual, but I won't go into those. But, the subject that you're talking about would probably be better. And the reason is because hypostasis is broader, right? On the one hand, hypostasis, behold, the hypostasis, it's Lila. On the other hand, behold, the hypostasis, my microphone. And so you might think, okay, well, what do those two things have in common? Well, let's find out.
The Christian East and the Christian West share the same creed, the same scriptures, and yet they are worlds apart. The differences run deeper than Mary or icons or liturgy, going to the very nature of God, the hope of salvation, and even what it means to be human. They use the same words, but their meanings could not be more different. As these two worlds collide in our contemporary culture, what's needed is a translator. I spent nearly 2 decades studying these two traditions, devoting myself to figures like Augustine, Aquinas, and the Reformers in the West, but finding myself crossing the threshold of the Eastern Orthodox Church. And now, I'm producing a 25-part lecture series to help bridge this gap, exploring the differences between Eastern and Western Christianity. Pre-order the series now at the lowest price that will ever be offered, or support my efforts by becoming a series producer at theeastwestseries.com. That's theeastwestseries.com.
Okay, so Epistle 38. One of the things that Epistle 38 establishes right away is it explains, and this explains why they like the word hypostasis, right? Is they say, look, an abstract nature has no stasis. Okay. Now that might sound strange, but here's the point. I mentioned realism. The realists believe that when we talk in general nouns like human, we're talking about something real. Human nature is something real. Now the question was, where is it? What is it? Does it exist? Does it subsist? And that's where you get into disputes between like Plato and Aristotle, for example. And extreme realists like Plato thought that the forms not only are real, but they exist. There's a second world that we're a material replica of. And then there were other realists like Aristotle who were like, no, like it's in you, right? The nature is actually in you. And so when talking about this, basically what Epistle 38 is, it commits to what is called moderate realism, which is the position of Aristotle, not of Plato. Okay, so moderate realism basically says this, that we can never have floating about in the air, as it were, the form or archetype of man, right? Because no matter how idyllic the form is, it's still a particular man, right? If I had floating here in the air a perfect circle, would it be the form of circle? And the answer is no, because the form of circle, the definition of it, doesn't have any definite size. This one would. Doesn't have any definite color. This one would. Doesn't have a definite location. This one would. Right? And so moderate realism always said that, like, yes, forms are real. Natures are real. They just don't float in the air. They're in things, right? Manifest in things. There's one of them, right? There's another one, right? And if you've ever seen Raphael's School of Athens, this is illustrated by Raphael with Plato and Aristotle in the center, where Plato's saying the forms, and he's pointing to the world of the forms, and Aristotle's going the forms, and he's pointing to the world. Right there, they are. Right now, the reason this is important because Epistle 38 is taking the moderate realist stance. Natures have no stasis; they're bare abstractions unless manifest within a hypostasis. Right? You, the subject, give it concrete stability. You have it. And you existing gives it concrete, stable, real existence. Right? And that's what Epistle 38 says. And so when it's talking about the hypostasis, right, what you're really talking about is the subject who exists and has a certain nature. And that's what a hypostasis is. And that's why I said this microphone's a hypostasis. Has a certain nature. It's an existent something. The chair is, the grass outside is, a dog is, you are, I am. And so the question of reason, is it relational? Is it personal? Is it rational? Well, that's about the nature. Humans are, right? I shouldn't say humans in the plural. A human is, a dog is not, right? So it all depends on the nature, but the hypostasis is just the existing subject who has it. Okay. Now, this is actually something that's uniquely Christian. Believe it or not, that might sound to you pretty common sense. Of course, there are individual subjects who exist and are of a certain nature, of course. But that's actually not in Greek philosophy. So what's interesting is if you look at the question of the individual subject in pagan philosophy and amongst the pagans, they don't know. They're like, I don't know. What makes an individual the individual? I don't know. Aristotle's like, I guess it's where we run out of general nouns. That's all he has to say about it, right? The Stoics are like, I don't know, maybe it's like a weird idiosyncratic property like Plato's stub nose. And maybe that's what makes him Plato. Porphyry is like, I don't know, maybe it's a unique bundle of universals. And then you get this phenomena of the individual. The Christians alone, because of the doctrine of the Trinity and then also Christology, were committed to the idea that the individual or the subject is its own existing reality that gives stability and existence to the underlying nature. Maximus the Confessor identifies it as exactly that, a uniquely Christian doctrine. Okay. Now, let's talk a little bit about identities, and then we'll come back to a quick summary before we go to the sort of qualifications we get, right? So in the basic sense, what we're talking about here is we have an understanding of when we say three hypostases, Mike, Tom, Tim, right? Common nature, human, right? Three hypostases, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, common nature, God, right? So now, the question is, of course, how do we differentiate that? And this goes to a point about identity. Now, in the case of Tom, or Tim, we can talk about location. Tom's over there, Tim's over here. We can talk about size. We can talk about color. We can talk about all sorts of accidental traits, right? Tim is bearded and Lila is not, right? All these sorts of things. We can go into those sorts of things. When we're talking about an invisible, immaterial, all-present spirit, what do you have to go with, right, in terms of differentiating them? And the very notable thing is that the answer is found in their names: Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And each of these is actually a relational identity, right? That you have the Father is the one who begets. That's what makes him the Father. And the Son is the one who is begotten. Now, the Spirit language is also, it's also a relational term, but we oftentimes lose it in English. The language of procession or spiration actually means outbreathing, and that's because spirit was always associated both Hebrew and in Greek with breath or wind, right? And so this is, breathe, the one who is breathed out by the Father. So these are relational terms. And this language, I'll just tell you, is it's causal. Now that, again, just like the other one about, are we talking about three gods? Sure sounds like we're talking about creatures now. I thought God is uncaused. If you're saying the Father's uncaused, the Son is caused, the Spirit's caused, aren't they not like God? If you're asking that question, you're not the first one in church history to ask it. There was an entire council called the Council of Nicaea that was, born out of that very issue. And it was a pesky issue because a lot of people, initially the Arians and the Semi-Arians and then the Eunomians and the Anomeans, and all had different ways of saying, look, I don't think causality and God are compatible. So they wanted to say the Son and the Spirit are creatures. But of course, the Nicene position is that they are not created. And again, we'll come back to that. But nonetheless, the relational properties that are there of the Father who begets and the Son who is begotten and the Spirit who is outbreathed, that's how you identify them. So we have our three hypostases, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, our common nature. They're all God. And then we have the relational identities, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Okay. Now, let's talk a little bit about this causation problem, right? The causation problem. There are three key things that you have to understand about causation to understand the pro-Nicene position, why they are caused but not created. Okay, the first thing that we have to understand is that causality is itself an ambiguous term. If we follow Aristotle, Aristotle talks about four causes, famously talks about four causes. And these are not hard to understand. So let's see. What can I choose here? I could pick a log, right? We have a burning log, right? Or we could pick a chair. If we had a chair here, right? We've got a chair right here. If we said formal cause, what it is, it's a chair, right? And then we'd say, okay, material cause. Of what is it made? Well, it's made of metal and fabric and things like that. Okay. Efficient cause. How did it come about? Well, somebody manufactured it. I presume it's manufactured. Okay. And then wire for what end? Final cause. For the purpose of being sat on. There you go. Those are the four causes. Now, the reason that's important is because in logic, if you leap from one cause, you start laying out premises about one cause and move to another, you've committed a logical category error. That's what it means. You move to a different category. And so it's important to understand these things so that you don't leap categories. And all of the arguments against the Nicene position leap categories, right? If I gave you an argument, for example, all that which is uncaused is God. That's true. The Son is caused. That's also true. Therefore, the Son is not God. Well, it depends on what you mean. Because if you're using God to mean the Father, then that's why I said it's true, right? God is uncaused. God the Father is uncaused. The Son is caused, so the Son is not the Father. Yep, that's true. Right? But if you mean by God the divine nature, all things divine, all things having the divine nature are as cause, that's actually not true. Right? And that specific argument I just used is one that Gregory of Nyssa combats with regard to the Eunomians. So Gregory points out that there is a difference between formal cause and efficient cause, and this is an important question. Let's take the story of the original family. right? So we have Adam. How does Adam come about? Taken from the dust of the earth, breathed into from heaven, right? So he is according to Luke's genealogy, right? He's begotten of God, but he's unbegotten by way of human origin, right? He's unbegotten. I'll say that. And then Eve, how does she come about? Well, a rib. We'll say that she proceeds from Adam's side. Very good. Very good. And then let's say we don't talk about Cain. We'll pick Abel. How does Abel come about? Well, beginning. Okay, so we have one who is unbegotten, one who proceeds, one who is begotten. But are they all human? The answer is yes. So you have three different efficient causes, how they come about, but one formal cause, what they are. And this happens all the time, right? You plant an acorn, a squirrel steals an acorn and drops it, whatever it is. However it might happen, that these different efficient causes happen and the same thing comes about, right? Same type of tree comes about. And so that's the important part, distinguishing between formal cause, what it is, and efficient cause. And so when you're talking about begetting, right, proceeding, unbegotten, you're talking about efficient cause, not what it is. And remember what we said about begetting. Begetting requires continuity of nature. It requires a common formal cause. And for this reason, basically, the Eastern Fathers insisted, the Pro-Nicenes insisted, that not all causation is creation. So the Son and the Spirit are indeed cause, they're just not created. Okay? And we'll come back to that again, more on that soon. But I'll just say one more thing. This ends up giving you what is sometimes called a sort of monarchical view of the Trinity, where what essentially you have is you have a certain hierarchy because the Father is the one who is unbegotten. He is the one who exists, who has the divine nature, and he is the one who begets or generates the Son and outbreathes the Spirit. And so you get this natural hierarchy where the Son is always doing the will of the Father and deferring to the Father. It's so interesting how often Christ will talk about his own attributes like goodness or even life, the life that he offers us, as being in the Father and given to him, right? He's not talking about as the incarnate Son. He's talking about by generation. He is God by generation. He has divine life in him by generation. So this is what creates a natural hierarchy. Just like in the first family, you had a hierarchy of Adamic headship, and then Eve, and then the children. All right. Now, this is where we have our basic summary, right? So this is where we distill it down and we've got our heads around, and it's not going to be a problem. It's not going to be a problem. So until we make problems, but so far so good. So, and I keep on coming back to this, because I want to make sure that we're solid on the basics here. That what you have is you have three distinct subjects, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That's our hypostases, the one who exists, these three that exists. They share a common nature. That common nature is God. They are divine in nature. The nature of the Father is the one that is eternally, now here's we get the causation. The Father is the one who has the divine nature from no one and gives it by begetting to the Son and by outbreathing to the Spirit. Two different modes of causation, but he gives it to both. And they are distinguishable based on those relational identities, that accidental trait, that unique accidental trait. Yeah.
But God begetting and outbreathing happens eternally.
Well, I'll get to that.
Oh, okay.
I feel like it's getting there. That's why I didn't ask Tom. Okay, let's keep on going.
Qualifications.
This would be things like, whether or not they it's eternal,
Already discussed. Did I already discuss, or was this a skipped slide? Or did I just miss it? Well, we haven't already discussed it, so it's a good thing it's in here for redundancy, because I didn't talk about it the first time. This goes to the eternal begetting. So Tom had pointed out, but the outbreathing and the begetting of the Son is eternal, right? Now, these are here. I'm using a couple of scholastic terms because I think they're actually useful. in explaining this. Conceptually, they're there in the Eastern Fathers. The terminology is taken from the Latin scholastics. And this is a difference between two different types of causes, per se versus per accidens causality. Okay, now that might sound fancy and intimidating, but it's pretty straightforward. Okay, so for example, I'm pretty sure Eric has children. Was there a time when Eric did not have children? Yes, okay. And then you decided to have children, you begat children. Now, if you drop dead right now, do your children continue to exist? Yes, okay, they do. All right. Wow, that was rough, Tim. That was rough.
Just like that.
Zing. Well, I'll drink to that. Oh, no. I mean, I'm sorry, Eric. I love you. No. I just needed an excuse to take a sip of my drink here. No, but so per accidens causality is exactly that. It's the sequential causality. A thing happens at a point in time, and then the effect happens, and it goes on. So you roll one ball and bumps into another ball, and that moment of transference of force is there, and then the other ball starts rolling and keeps on cooking. And even if we incinerated the ball that knocked it, it'd just keep on rolling, right? That's per accidens causality, right? Per se causality is ongoing or yes. So right now, for example, I'm holding up this microphone. That is a cause-effect relationship, and it's ongoing. The suspension of the microphone is something that is coterminous with me holding it up, and that's different. Now, the reason that's important is because in our human, and this is where I talked about, right? We start with the things that we understand, right? And then we start to add the qualifications. So in human begetting, it is exactly what we said. It's per accidens, right? Abraham begets Isaac. And, most parents will end up dying before their children do. But their children continue to exist, right? It's per accidens. But in the case of the Trinity, the begetting that is there is eternal beginning, meaning it is coterminous. The Father is always begetting or generating the Son. It is ongoing. And so it is with the Spirit. It's a different mode of causation, analogically outbreathing, right? Something different than beginning, also coterminous. One of the analogies that I think is sometimes helpful for getting your mind around this is something like, if we imagine that the sun, and here I mean S-U-N, since we're talking about the Trinity, I always have to spell it, right? We're talking about the sun, the big flaming ball in the sky, right? And we were like Aristotle. We believed that the world had always existed. It's always been there, right? No matter how far back we go, when we imagine the sun, we'd also imagine its light and its heat, right? But both would be causally dependent, right? So no matter how far back you go with the sun, you would continue to find the sun generating light and heat. It's a coterminous per se causal relationship in that sense. And that's one of the analogies that you can use for the Trinity. To think of the Father is to think of him begetting the Son and outbreathing the Spirit. And so as long as the Father's been around, he's been doing that, which is to say he's always been around. So that's one of the things. So that's a distinction that needs to be kept in mind when talking about the causality side of this. And that's also one of the things that also helps guard against creating, right? Because a creature, the telltale sign of Arianism was there was a time when the Son was not, because Arius was thinking in terms of per accidens. The Father's hanging out. He's not the Father. He decides he wants to be a father. Poof, he makes a son, and voila, we've got a godlike creature. That's how Arius is thinking about it, as opposed to the way the New Testament and the Pro-Nicenes think about it, which is to say that the Father is always giving his own nature to these two others. Additional caveats. When it comes to this causation, right, they admit, they're like, we don't know. We don't know what that causation is like. We just don't know. I don't know. I don't know how God causes, other hypostatic, members of the Trinity. But except to say a bunch of negative things. And the reason these negations are added is because they don't match with the divine nature, right? So, for example, there's no secretion, right? It's not like there's some goo that drips off the Father and now you get the Son, right? Like they're separate bodies. There's no mutation, right? Where, slowly he gestates and he becomes the Son of God, right, over time or something like that. There is no separation, right, where you have two different subjects, the Son over here and the Father over there. And so they'll offer all these sorts of qualifications that are uniquely human. There's no materiality to it because they're not matter, right? So there's no matter being sort of used in the process. And so they'll add all these negative things, but they'll grant. They're like, I don't know what it's like for God to beget. I know what it's like for a human to beget, or a horse to beget, or a dog to beget. I don't know what it's like for God to beget, right? But it's not. And then they add all of those qualifications. And then one of these I've already touched on, but I'll touch on it in particular. They are distinct, but they are not separate. And so you find two terms that are used in order to make sure that you get both sides of this coin. And you can find these in liturgical texts, for example, that they are undivided, right? Now, the reason the undivided part is important is because Tim and Tom are undivided. Why? Because they're material bodies. They're finite. Tim, we know the boundary line of Tim.
And we're divided.
You are divided. You guys are divided, right? Tim, we know the boundary line of Tim. We know the boundary line of Tom. God doesn't have a boundary line. And if you want the Greek terms, it's paragraptos, meaning you can draw a line around Tim. God is aparagraptos. You can't draw a line around it. And so the idea of them being separated, like they are finite bodies, is something that doesn't apply. And this is what is sometimes called perichoresis. Right. So perichoresis, at least one of the claims in etymology is like to make room for, like in a dance, right? Two people are dancing and you make room for the other. One of the analogies that you can find in Gregory of Nazianzus to explain this, he's like, well, let's just imagine three suns. I already used the sun for eternal generation. Let's use three suns, S-U-N, in the sky. And he said they would be three distinct hypostases. They'd have a common nature, sun. But if you glanced up, you probably wouldn't be able to see that there's three. You'd be blinded by this glory that intermingles, and you gotta be like, I can't tell you where the one ends and the other starts. And he says that's kind of what it's like, right? Where they are undivided because they are three omnipresent spirits, right? Now, on the other hand, what he doesn't want you to do is fall into the idea that they get mashed up and confused as if they are somehow no longer distinct. And this is an important one. This is one that they probably didn't emphasize as much as we should today because of the contemporary obsession with monotheism. But some people are so obsessed with saying, I'm a monotheist, that they're like, well, we got three guys and then we try to collapse them into one guy again, right? And that's one of the reasons why, just as much as they'll say they're undivided, they'll also say unconfused, right? Because they absolutely are distinct. They're not separate. They are distinct. Okay. And then one final thing I'll add here is just the harmony that you find between the persons, which is unique. Okay. And this goes to a couple of different things. This obviously, on the one point, goes to the very fact that with the causality that I mentioned, the Son is always begotten. So my son can be like, screw you, Dad, I want to join the circus. And I'll be like, no, you're better than that, son. And he can be like, I'm out of here, right? That's not possible within the Trinity. And it's not possible for a couple of reasons. One, the causal relationship is of such a kind that it is coterminous. There is no autonomy to be had in terms of these persons. That's one thing. But the other thing is also that they are perfect. They share a common will. Now, this, again, I need to qualify because once again, with the monotheist boogeyman, there's a lot of people who want to say one will. Yes, they're a hive mind. And all of a sudden you get like three faces with one guy talking behind them or something like that. That is not what they mean by one will. They mean one type of will. So the will is a faculty. We have one will, which is something they also say. Because we're all human, and will is a faculty, right? So you have the faculty of human will. You have the faculty of human will. You get a will. You get a will, right? That's true. but how you use it is idiosyncratic. And that's true in the Trinity as well. They have one will, a divine will. How they use it is different. Okay? The Son uses it to obey the Father. The Father does not obey the Father. Right? Those are two different things. They are distinct hypostases. They use the divine will differently, but they always do it harmoniously. The Son delights in doing the will of the Father. Why? Because they're perfect. Unlike you and me, who can disagree and we're corrupt and we don't operate harmoniously. That's why we have to pray that God's will would be done on earth as it's done in heaven. Right? Where perfect beings do operate harmoniously in accord with the will of God. All right. Now, since I've been bashing monotheism, let me go ahead and talk a little bit about this word monotheism and one of the reasons why I think it's a bit of a boogeyman and we need to be cautious about. I'll be curious to know whether or not you think I'm going to say that we're monotheists or not. Tim's placed his bet. I don't know where the Holly markets are at, but okay. So let me say a word about monotheism and how this term is developed within modernity. Okay. So as an outgrowth of what's called perfect being theology, which I'll talk about shortly, there emerged this concept, right? This way of talking about God that what do you mean by the word God? We mean the optimal being, right? A being greater than which none other can be conceived, right? A being that none greater can be conceived of. And for this reason, there was almost a tendency, and again, it wasn't almost a tendency, it actually was a tendency to collapse the personhood and the nature. So in the case of most other things in our experience, if I were saying, Tim, do you see that bowl? Tim would know I'm talking about a hypostasis, an instantiation, a particular. But if I said, are you aware of bowl, the nature of bowlness, like then he wouldn't need a particular thing. And what's interesting is that within perfect being theology and in modernity, which is inherently perfect in being theology, there's a tendency to collapse the distinction between the particular and the nature, so that as long as we are talking about the optimal being, one who is omniscient, omnipotent, this all men call God, and there we go. And the challenge is that what begins to emerge is the presumption is that everyone is talking about the same God. This is what gives the basis in modernity for rational religion. Rational religion basically meant, okay, the deists believe in this God, the Jews believe in this God, the Christians believe in this God, the Muslims believe in this God. We just disagree about what he's done, right? We just disagree about whether he talked to Moses. We disagree about whether he has a son. We disagree about whether or not, he created the world and is aloof and just gave us conscience. We disagree about that stuff, but we're talking about the same thing because we're talking about this abstract nature, the optimal being. And that gives rise to a concept of monotheism. Like anybody who believes in this optimal being is a monotheist. They believe that there is one optimal being. And then, of course, that's what creates the anxiety for Christians who are like, we're monotheists too. And they're like, don't you believe in the Trinity? And we're like, well, I mean, we do, but it's like we got three that collapse into one. And so it's still the same guy. Incidentally, if your monotheism agrees with people who deny the Trinity, you're probably not a Trinitarian. But nonetheless, it happens. Now, the reason I think this is important, go ahead, Lila, is that this is not how the ancients, Christians included, talk about monotheism. That's an innovation. It's different. So in the most ancient forms of religion, of course, when you talked about the gods, you were talking about subjects. You weren't even talking about abstract natures. You were talking about persons, immortals. You named them. That's how you knew what you were talking about. And then once the discussion emerges about whether they are similar or not, right? On the one hand, it became pretty clear that God was a genus. They are the immortals, but they are all different in kind. And so essentially the immortals were a certain category of being in which there were many types, and that was polytheism. Now, the reason I think this is important is because when you look at the way the Eastern Church Fathers talk about polytheism and monotheism, and they identify themselves as monotheists, they have in mind the ancient concept of polytheism. So, what they mean, Basil of Caesarea, Gregory of Nyssa, what they mean when they say they are monotheists, they mean we believe there's only one nature worthy of the name God. And it is not a group or category of types of beings. It's not the immortals. We think there is a highest nature. That's the only one worthy of being called divine. But then you would also find Gregory of Nyssa, for example, say, and yet in our contention with the polytheists and denying that there is a multiplicity of divinities, we do not sink to the level of the Jew who denies that that God has a son. So the question of how many subjects had it was not the question of polytheism. It was a question of whether you believe that there was only one type of divinity, as contrasted with the pagan concept. Now, this, of course, is how somebody like Gregory of Nyssa will go ahead and say that he is a monotheist. Why? Because just like when I said that Mike and Tom and Tim are one human, so he would say that Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are one God, meaning there's only one divine nature and all three have it. But he is not saying there are not three guys who have it. There are three who have it, and they are distinct and unconfused. God has a son. And if you deny it, well, you're probably not a Trinitarian. Okay. Now, let me just say a little bit of here just about New Testament and creedal language, which might be helpful. And this is unfortunate that this stuff gets lost in translation because it's really useful. So, within the Greek language, for anybody who's never studied any amount of Greek, words will sometimes appear with the definite article and sometimes without the definite article. So when you're talking about God, for example, theos, it can be ha theos, definite article, or theos. Okay. The thing is, consistently what you find in both the New Testament and in creedal language, and also in the Church Fathers, Eastern Church Fathers, is that when the definite article is used, ha theos, the God, it's talking about a subject. It's talking about a person. It's talking about the Father. When the definite article is dropped, theos, it's now being used as a predicate identifying the type of thing you are. So when I say Tim is human, that would be the sort of thing it's being used. So if you talk about the God, you're talking about the Father, the subject, or the hypostasis. If you say Jesus is theos, you're not saying he's the Father. You're saying he too is divine. He has the divine nature, just like the Father does. And this is important. This is a wildly consistent thing. And it also addresses a question. There was something on X that showed up, somebody sent to me, and they were like, can you solve this challenge? And I was like, oh, sure. Which was that somebody was like, how come Jesus just doesn't show up and say, I'm God? If he's God, give me the passage where he says it. And one of the things I pointed out is that if you actually understand the New Testament language, you understand Trinitarian metaphysics, all that sort of stuff, he wouldn't say, I'm ha theos, because that would be saying I'm the Father, and he's not. But if you want any number of places where he's identified as theos, yeah, that happens a lot. And that's an important thing to understand. Even the Nicene Creed does not begin, I believe in one God, the Holy Trinity. It says, I believe in one God, the Father, right? And in the, and in the Son and in the Spirit. His only begotten Son. All right. So that's just an important thing to understand in terms of language. And it's something that's played out within the New Testament, within the creedal language, that whenever talking about God, it talks about the monarch, whenever identifying the Son or the Spirit as divine and uses it as a predicate. That is the nature that they have. Incidentally, actually, I didn't have this in the slides, but I'll just go ahead and say it. It's remarkable how precise the New Testament is in this way. I mean, it shouldn't be, surprising if it's really God-breathed, but it is remarkable that when you look at somebody like St. Paul, his letter to the Philippians, for example, I want your attitude to be the same as Christ, so he identifies a subject, who being in the form of God, Okay, now the reason that's important language is because form is morphe. It's one of the synonyms that I said that you could use for ousia, right? It can only mean one of two things. It either means shape, and he's already said God's invisible. So the alternative is he means the nature of God. Being in nature God. Did not consider equality with the God, now he's talking about the other subject, something to be clung to, but humbled himself. How? By taking on the nature, the morphe, of a servant, namely us. It's incredibly precise. And the New Testament is incredibly precise from start to finish on this very point. It's remarkable. And it's remarkable also how nuanced it is in things like causality. I'll just give you one of my favorites. Basil of Caesarea would ask why the Son says that he doesn't know the day or the hour. And he says, well, I'll give you the answer. It's the answer I heard in church. He's like, I'm sure it won't satisfy any heretics, but that's fine. And he's like, but I'll give you the answer that I heard as in church as a little kid, which means obviously this predates Basil. And he points out that there are two different times Christ says this, and each time he modifies it. So in the one, and these would be, there's manuscript variants here. The manuscript variants he's talking about correspond to the King James, in case you're curious. But he says, the first time he says, nobody knows the day or the hour, neither angels nor men, but the Father only. And he says here, there's no mention of the Son. This happens all the time. You know, Jesus talking about things that are true of God and not mentioning himself, and it's implicit that it's true of him, right? Second time he says it, though, it gets more problematic. Nobody knows the day or the hour, neither angel nor men, nor the Son, but the Father. And all of a sudden you go, whoa, what's going on there? Well, there was two changes in that statement. One is the addition of the Son, and the other is the dropping of the word only. And how the Eastern Fathers understand that is, of course, the Son knows the day and the hour. He ends up revealing every detail about it to the Apostle John. But that knowledge that he knows about the day or the hour is the Father's. So just like he talks about the Father has life in himself, and he's given it to me to have life in myself, but you won't come to me to have life. So he talks that way about his own goodness, about his own knowledge, those sorts of things. So it's remarkable. Okay, let's talk about the ways in which, why is it that if this is what Nicene Trinitarianism is, why is it that you end up having certain developments related to the Trinity that don't seem to sound like this? And there's very good reason for that. And here we get to the Western view. So with the West, on the one hand, the West has always been committed to Nicene Trinitarianism. I mentioned that right here at the outset. However, the lenses by which the West interpreted the doctrine of the Trinity over time evolved for very specific reasons. Augustine of Hippo. Augustine wrote a treatise on the Trinity, and within that treatise, he admits something very important. He says, I'm sure you could find the answer to any question you might ask about the Trinity and the Greek writers, but most of us over here, myself included, don't read Greek well enough to know what the heck they're talking about, so I'm going to have to wing this and rely on God. That's actually what he says at the start of his treatise. And when he gets to the term hypostasis, he's like, the Greek words hypostasis, I don't know what this means. Nobody really knows. I mean, does anybody really know what this means? I mean, I'm just like, so what is a person? And all that sort of like, what is a person stuff is what starts to unfold. And what he comes up with is not Nicene. I'm sorry, it's just not. He doesn't come to the same conclusion that you find in like Epistle 38. He ends up coming to the conclusion that, well, person, we've been using persona in the Latin side, as our equivalent. What is a persona? And he comes to the conclusion, well, right now, I have taken on the persona of a teacher, and you are taking on the persona of a student. And so maybe it is a relational identity. And therefore, what you end up having is you have that the Trinity is the divine essence or nature that relates to itself in a paternal manner, producing both a paternal identity toward itself and, the identity of being a son to itself, right? While also loving, if you've ever heard, and the Holy Spirit is the love between the Father and the Son. That's what he throws in. And God loves himself. And so loving himself, that's the third persona. And that's what he comes up with. Now, there are problems with this, and I'll get to these problems, why this is not Nicene, but that is not the Nicene view of what a hypostasis is. It's true that the persons are identified according to relations. It is not true that what a hypostasis is a relation. That's not true. So, the other thing that is about that is a very significant issue with Augustine is a doctrine that he inherits from the Platonists. He says explicitly within his Confessions, he talks about basically all Augustine scholars will grant that Augustine basically undergoes two conversions, one that is spiritual and one that is intellectual. His intellectual conversion is by reading certain books of the Platonists, most likely Plotinus. That's what most scholars think. And in his imbibing of Platonism, his early enthusiasm for Platonism, and he was enthusiastic about Platonism. He said at one point, "I am convinced I will find nothing in the writings of the Platonists that conflict with Holy Scripture." He probably hadn't read Porphyry's treatise against Christianity at that point, but but nonetheless, he later retracted that in his retractions. He's like, okay, I was a little zealous about it, But anyway, one of the doctrines that he inherits is this idea that God is a super simple essence. And this is kind of complicated for people who aren't familiar with metaphysics, but I talked about the common natures, right, that we have. And I talked about the difference between Plato and Aristotle, that Plato thinks there's a second world of the forms, and we're all material copies of it. Well, the problem is that with Plato, he thinks that the forms are generated by the good, right? That there's something higher than the forms from which they all come, because the forms are the good of a thing, and there's something higher is God, right? And that's something higher, the form of the good or the good, ends up being something that is super simple. And what does that mean? Well, it means that unlike a square, which has four sides, right angles, things like that, all of you and me and every other nature we might name is complex, right? We are species within a genus. Whereas the good, right, God, is simple, a super simple essence. And this starts to give rise to this commitment, gives rise to a couple of things. And these commitments appear in Augustine, but they get really refined in what's called perfect being theology. Somebody like Anselm of Canterbury is a good example of this, but it appears in Aquinas as well. But perfect being theology basically ends up advocating the idea that what we mean by God is we mean a being the greater than which cannot be conceived, right? And so if I can think of, if it's like, okay, God knows most things, God knows all things. Well, the being who knows all things would be superior, so therefore clearly God must know all things, right? That's perfect being theology. If the idea could be surpassed, then that's not true of God, right? That's a perfect being theology. So he's an optimal being. And one of the things that starts to happen is some odd, they're odd. Some odd conclusions, like that all of the attributes are the same attribute. And so this becomes a really strange thing where the insistence is, well, let's say that there's a certain good to my hand, right? Hand's a good. Well, the problem is it's only in my hand. But if I had that good as all of me, then that would be superior. And so the conclusion becomes that God is can't be just part of him, can't be just or loving or merciful. He must be all. And then the conclusion is also that a being who has these things, as opposed to being these things, would be inferior. So he has to be all these things. And then also simplicity was thought to be superior to complexity. And so therefore, he has to not only be all of those things, but all of those things have to be one and the same thing. And this ends up meaning that even his existence and his essence are the same thing. Okay, so that's where you get this doctrine of simplicity in the Latin West, where these things end up collapsed. Now, the reason this is problematic, if we take these things, you start to see the very real East-West divide that starts to emerge here over time on the doctrine of the Trinity. So for the West, as I just said, the nature of God exists, right? According to Augustine, according to Anselm, according to Aquinas, right? God's existence is his essence, and his essence is his existence. Now, this is a problem, because what did I say about the hypostasis? no nature, not even the divine nature, exists. It always subsists in a hypostasis. And so for the East, the principle of existence, the locus of existence is God the Father who exists and has the divine nature and gives that nature to another. For the Latin West, the divine nature exists and then relates to itself, and the persons are on top of that. So in terms of which is sort of first, not temporally, but ontologically, for the East, the Father is the ground of the Trinity. For the West, the divine nature is the ground of the Trinity. And I think this plays out in a lot of ways where you can see a tendency within the West to talk about the Trinity as like a fourth thing, right? There's a tendency within the West to want to talk about God, and they really kind of mean the divine nature to which the persons are appended. And I think that actually is ultimately the groundwork for what happens in terms of monotheism in modernity. Also, another very important thing that starts to happen here in these distinctions, obviously, we could go through and we could name the other things, right? We could talk about the fact that hypostasis is defined differently. We could talk about the fact that the causality of a hypostasis is very different than sort of the type of thing that you're talking about in the relational identities of the West. But one of the most obvious one is the filioque. And so this is the addition for people who don't know. The filioque in Latin, when you add que to the end of a word, that means and. And so filioque is and the Son in Latin. And so in the Nicene Creed as originally formulated, it was originally drafted at Nicaea, expanded at Constantinople. That's the one that's said today. That did not include, in reference to the Spirit, that the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. It was that the Spirit proceeds from the Father. And you'll notice that as I talked about Nicene Trinitarianism, I kept saying that, right? That the Father outbreathes. In the Latin West, it becomes the Father and the Son. Now, why is that? Well, the reason is because that becomes required by Augustine's understanding. So for Augustine, it becomes very, very, very important throughout his treatise on the Trinity that everything about the divine relations in time mirror exactly the divine relations in eternity. And why? Because the persons are relations. If a different relation shows up, that's a different guy. Okay? So think of it this way, right? If I have a gash in my leg and I'm tending to my leg, this is sort of an Augustinian Trinitarianism, I am now a physician to myself and a patient to myself at the same time, right? Now, if I'm going to show up as a physicianing, I better show up in the room physicianing if I'm going to be patient and doctor. And if I show up doing something else, then I risk a new persona, okay? Now, what that means is then when you look at, say, Pentecost, and Jesus references the Spirit who proceeds from the Father that he's going to send, Augustine doesn't have a means of separating those relations. The sending has to happen in eternity as well as in time. If it happens in time, it has to happen in eternity. If it happens in eternity, it has to happen in time. Eastern Fathers just don't have that. They're like, procession, we're just talking about causality. What he does, right, who sends him, that's totally different. It's not even related. And this ends up being, a critical difference in how they think about those texts, as well as how then later polemics will read church fathers based on that. And so for that reason, with the East, you're capable of talking about the difference between causation and operations. So all that's to say is that in terms of how this grows out in the East and the West, and I can talk more about these sorts of things, suffice it to say that that basic difference that you have there in terms of the nature existing and the person sort of being a persona about self-relation, the nature being the ground of existence as opposed to the Father, the different definition of the persons as opposed to a hypostasis, and then the sort of necessity of parallel relations of time and eternity that give you the necessity of the filioque and things like that. These become points at which very real divides that I think are opaque to most people just sort of come to the surface. And truth be told, I think most people who stumble on a filioque dispute, they're like, I have no idea what's happening. and they don't know why this is even a thing, yet less a thing that would cause the Great Schism, right? But nonetheless, hopefully this provides a little bit of context for that. And I'll leave it at that for tonight. I'm happy to take questions. I think that's the last slide. Is that my last slide? Yeah, it is. All right, there it is. All right. Yes.
Wait,
You need to grab a mic so that they can hear it.
Oh, they can't hear this inside?
no,
For the question.
Oh, so that they can hear him. I gotcha. And meanwhile, Bo, give me a water and maybe some popcorn or something. Yeah, sure. Yeah, what's that? Oh, yeah.
It's channel 1.
Testing. Oh, simple. Hold on.
Yeah.
See it.
Oh, was this for me?
Yeah.
All this time?
Yeah.
Oh, man. I've been sitting here starving like a sucker. Whew.
Stand up.
Hello?
No, it's You know what? For now, why don't you repeat the question?
Now.
It's channel 1. Repeat the question into the headphone before you ask it.
That's fine. I'm fine with it.
It should be.
Just keep talking. Get your questions.
All right.
So, why was Augustine so influential on the West?
Great question.
Just repeat that.
No, I'm not going to repeat it. You don't want to smoke. No, I'm just kidding. No, said the guy who's not smoking. No, the question was, why was Augustine so influential on the West? There's very good reasons for this. First of all, Augustine in general was probably I don't think it's even close. We shouldn't even say probably. Why did I say probably? He's the most prolific of the Latin Church Fathers. Okay. So you have that. You have that he is a very gifted rhetor. So in terms of his own, impact of what his own impact in terms of what he's writing, in terms of what he's doing, he's casting a massive shadow. He was a bishop, obviously, that gives massive weight to what he's doing. He's traveling and preaching in all these different churches. And so in that sense, you have a natural sort of in his own day. Is the mic cutting in and out, or is that my imagination? So in his own day, it makes sense. It makes sense why he would cast such a massive shadow. Now, I think the really definitive thing that happens, though, is Lombard sentences. So Lombard sentences is basically a collection of sayings or sentences from the Church Fathers. Now, if you scrutinize it, it's largely sentences from Augustine. And then you have Alexander of Hale's gloss on the sentences, where basically you're adding headers that differentiate different topics. And in the Latin West, what happens is the very way in which he become a doctor of theology, right, within the Latin West, is to write a sentence commentary. So all of theological training becomes, on all of these topics, you need to contend with and read these doctrines in accord with Augustine in order to basically be legit. And you add to that other sorts of things like the Pelagian controversy. The Pelagian controversy, some of these specifically Western controversies, ended up shaping Latin theology in ways that was definitive but not ecumenical. So, for example, Pelagianism, a lot of the outgrowth of the Pelagian dispute, that became like the red line in Western theology. It remained a red line in the Reformation. Protestants cannot be Pelagian, right? Catholics cannot be Pelagian. That's the death knell to anybody. You're a heretic if you do that. And yet, the entire framework of the dispute between Pelagius and Augustine is something that's wholly idiosyncratic to the Latin West. And so I would say that it's a mix of things from Augustine's own massive influence in his own day, paired with certain controversies that for Latin or Western writers became red lines that hemmed them in, paired with then the training of theologians in the Latin West who are now using Augustine as the lens through which they learn theology in the first place. And I think that's how it ends up proliferating. Yeah.
How does how do they understand how to Repeat the question.
So the question was about how with the East and the West, how they understand the fall and how it differs. And I would look at you politely, but when I do that, the mic cuts out for some reason. So I'm just going to look at Tim because that's the only safe zone I have. Tim's like, it's always been the only safe zone. So in terms of anthropology and the fall, you have some pretty critical differences that begin to emerge. And I mentioned the Pelagian dispute, which is part of this. So within Augustine, what you end up having because of the Pelagian dispute, and this is the Western framework, within the West, there is a tendency, with Augustine, there was always a tendency prior to Augustine to think in terms of merits and demerits, right? And so that was something that was, it becomes amplified with Augustine, but it's there. You can find other Latin writers talking about merits and demerits, right? Now, it's not clear that within the earlier Latin writers, it's as dogmatized and formulated the way it would be later, but it's there as part of their thinking. And that's probably largely due to the fact that they're in the Latin West. They're in the center of law. And so there was a tendency to think theologically in terms of law, in terms of punishments, in terms of those sorts of things. And so that sort of hyper-legalization of Rome ended up playing its way out theologically. Now, with Augustine, what happens in the Pelagian dispute is that there's a certain question that Augustine is asking and answering, which is initially he's trying to answer the question of like, well, within the Vulgate, right, the Latin New Testament, he's looking at this and saying, well, okay, what is the just man, right? So there's this justice that is from God, and we have this hope of through faith becoming just, because that's what it's being translated as. And he's like, so what is it that is just? And justitia in Latin means you render to each its due, okay? And so within this context, what Augustine wants to say is he's like, okay, he ends up advocating for this idea of what's called an order of loves. Which is to suggest that when you operate and you do a deed, you do it from a certain order of loves, and that order of loves can be just or unjust. So, for example, if I'm sitting here and I'm thinking like, oh, I could eat popcorn, but I'm being carnivore. I'm not. But let's just pretend, right? All of a sudden I'm in a conflict. Do I love the benefits of carnivore more than I love popcorn? Or do I love popcorn more than I love carnivore? And whatever choice I make, I'm not going to eat the popcorn, right? I'm choosing one thing over another. A certain love is winning out. And so Augustine suggests that whenever you make a choice, your choice displays a hierarchy of loves, an order of loves. And so his conclusion is that the just man is somebody whose orders of loves mirror reality. Love of God, love of man, right? That there actually is a hierarchy to nature in terms of goods, and the just man loves things according to their suitable, how much good they actually have. Now, the thing is, in early Augustine, pre-Pelagian dispute, if you ask Augustine, what do you do if you find that your order of loves is messed up, sinful? His answer is, well, you will to fix it. After the Pelagian dispute, you can't say that. And so in the Pelagian dispute, because the question becomes, in what sense is salvation by grace or through God's help? Now what starts to happen is Augustine's commitment to the idea that after the fall, I am both guilty for Adam's sin, right? In some ways, I was either a participant in it or something like that, but that guilt is weighed upon me. And I have disordered loves that I can't fix. And so now everything that I do is sinful, right? The necessity of sin. And I'm already guilty, so we're all a damned mass. Right? And what grace is this effect where God says, well, I'm going to flip your order of love so that you now can do things that are pleasing to me. And this is what's called prevenient grace. It's a grace that precedes your action. And now if you use that prevenient grace, I'm going to take hold of that grace and I'm going to actually do good deeds. Now I can operate in accord with that grace. And now operating with properly ordered loves, I have merits before God. And this is one of the reasons why, if you've ever heard in Catholic Protestant disputes, Protestants are like, you guys believe in work salvation. The Catholics are, no, we think salvation is by grace. And that's true. The Catholic position is that salvation is by grace, because if you do good deeds that have merit, you could only do that because of a prior grace that's at work in the subject. Right. So that's the position that starts to emerge there. And that becomes how Augustine combats Pelagianism, trying to say that you have some sort of free choice whether or not to use grace or cast it off. And you can cast it off and resist it. And this is where you can get the concepts like venial and mortal sins and things like that. Or you can just operate in accord with that grace and continue to accrue merits. Now, going back to the fall, you raised a question about the fall. So one of the big questions, of course, is, was it different before the fall? Right? Because is it true that Adam could naturally just do things pleasing to God before the fall? And Augustine is very much no quarter when it comes to Pelagius. And so his answer is no. And what he suggests is that Adam is created with original righteousness, so he's already got the prevenient grace. Just, it's baked in, right? Original righteousness. And that's why for Adam it would be easy to not sin, as he says in his Enchiridion. But then he decides to sin and he casts it off. And then in casting it off, he is both guilty and he ends up being incapable of producing meritorious deeds. Everything of necessity is sin. That condition is passed on to us, right? And Augustine, I get, a lot of people get annoyed when I talk about like guilt and inherited guilt with Augustine. But the fact of the matter is, it's somewhat ambiguous in Augustine. Augustine definitely thinks that we end up in a damned condition. Now, the question is why? Were we in Adam participating in the sin? Were we in Adam's loins? And it's part of like, the procreation process. He toys with different things. He's fascinated by Tertullian, sort of Traditionism and things like that. But nonetheless, the fact of the matter is that Augustine ends up in the position that we inherit a condition where we bear guilt and we also of necessity sin, and only prevenient grace can come in and help that. Okay, so that's sort of the Western view, and that doesn't change. I mean, Calvinists get pegged as for total depravity, but that's just standard Augustinian theology. Like, that's what the Lutherans think. That's what everybody thinks in the West. Like, total depravity, it doesn't mean you're the worst you can be. It just means everything you do of necessity is sin because you don't have any natural capacity to do meritorious deeds. Everybody thinks that. Just sounds really bad when you say you're totally depraved. That's all. It's just bad marketing. It's not innovative doctrine. Right?
This wasn't in these.
No, this is not of these. I'll get to these. But so that's the baseline in terms of understanding that. Within the Christian East, it's quite different. And it's quite different for a couple of reasons. And this, I'm like turning this into a separate lecture all its own, but it's not a small question. One of the big things that you have there within the Augustinian framework, which is true in the Latin West, is a nature-grace divide. And so nature of its own core just cannot be pleasing to God in its own way. And this becomes really clear in the medievals. William of Ockham toys with the idea. He's like, well, God could create a world where nature could be pleasing to God of its own might, but he just didn't. And they're like, that's too close to Pelagianism. That's heresy. Like, not even like, so the Latin position ends up being like, not even God could make a world that could naturally be pleasing to God, right? It needs that supernatural assistance. And so that becomes the sort of the Latin position. Within the Christian East, what you end up having is something very different. You have a very different anthropology. And I'll try to truncate this so I don't turn this into a whole different lecture. But first of all, within the Christian East, the understanding of grace is that it is actually a divine energy. And I'm not going to give a whole lecture on that here, but within, this is a big divide in the Christian East and the Christian West. In the Christian East, you have a distinction not only between God's essence, but also God's essence and his energies, right? And this is a distinction that the Latin West doesn't have. And the idea is that these energies, the attributes of God, things, are things that exude from God. And so an analogy that's sometimes used to explain this is things like, fire and metal, right? That if you have fire, you have the nature of fire is one thing, it exudes or demonstrates or shows forth its nature by heating and lighting. I have the nature of mind, right? How you know that is through the operations that I'm speaking and I'm reasoning with, right? And so that distinction between what God is in himself versus how he operates his operations was a critical distinction. And with that distinction came the belief that in some cases, certain operative powers or energies are communicable. So with fire, you put iron in it, it begins to glow and burn. You remove it from the fire, it's still glowing and burning. The operative powers or energies of fire have taken up residence in the iron, it communes with it. And that was a big thing. Well, it's a big thing within the New Testament, but it's also a big thing within the Eastern Fathers. Now, the reason that's important is because how the Eastern Fathers understand the nature of man as an icon is that us being an icon of God makes us capable of communing with the energies of God in various likeness. So all of the things that we're told that we're supposed to become, not just virtuous, merciful, loving, all these sorts of things, but also having eternal life, for example. One of the things that they see is, that St. Paul is really clear, God alone is immortal. Immortality, incorruption, these are things that are uniquely divine. And yet in the resurrection, we're supposed to put off mortality for immortality, corruption for incorruption. Again, this is what Christ says, the life that he has in himself, he offers to you, which is divine life. And that's why the Arian dispute is so critical. Unless he has the life of God in him, he can't give it to you. And so that was a critical feature of that. Now, the reason that's important is because, first of all, within the Latin West, grace is created. It's an effect. I'm going to change your order of loves, right? Whereas in the East, grace is God. It's one of the divine energies. Within the East, in the anthropology, the fact that you are an image of God is what makes it possible for you to commune with the divine energies. And that's why you're supposed to take on the likeness of God, which Adam never did, which is what happens when you commune with the divine energies, which we only see for the first time in the resurrected Christ. And then also with that, one of the things that you see is, unlike in the sort of Augustinian Western paradigm, where once you cast off grace and things like that, you're sort of just stuck in your natural state and you need prevenient grace. Within the Eastern Fathers, there is no breaking the tether between you and God. You have a natural connection to God right now as an icon of God. And as, St. Anthony puts it, if you just untwist the soul, it does what it's naturally made to do, which is deify you. And so within the Eastern Fathers, the fall has more to do with that you have a higher and lower nature, an animal nature and a rational nature, a spirit and an animal body. And the fall is really just an inversion or a twisting of that cripples what should be your natural capacity to commune with God and be deified. And everything about the faith and the incarnation, everything is just about untwisting that and putting it back right so that it'll do what it was made to do in the first place. That's my very long answer to your very short question. Who do I go? I'll go to you, sir.
Okay.
Yeah.
No bit heat to us.
Yeah.
This is probably an order question.
Oh, I know.
Yeah. I'm sure you're trying to.
I became a Christian late teen years.
Okay.
And one of the readings that impacted me tremendously was C.S. Lewis' Mere Christianity. It's been a long time since I've read it, but it could have been 4 pages, 10 pages. I can't remember. But he talked about the Trinity.
Yep.
I'm guessing, the answer, where did we stand on the Trinity? It made sense at the time.
Yeah.
I can't articulate it.
Yeah. So Lewis, one of the things that's interesting about Lewis is that Lewis is a Westerner, obviously he's an Anglican, but Lewis is heavily versed in and very reliant upon the Eastern Church Fathers. And so it's really interesting that Lewis, a lot of times people will read Lewis and they'll be like, it's so creative and unique and unusual. It's just such an innovator. And the answer is, he's not really at all. Like if you know his source material, it's just acting like Eastern Church Fathers. And so a lot of things that he says in Mere Christianity are very Eastern. When he explains the gospel, his understanding of that, he actually talks about, he uses these analogies of Pinocchio and like becoming a real human being through being transformed. He talks about biological life versus divine life, a lot of things that I just talked about. On the Trinity, one of the things that he does talk about is he certainly gets correct the per se, per accidens causality stuff. So he keeps it very truncated. And the main thing that he talks about is from what I recall, the main thing that he talks about is mainly the causal relating. And there he uses like an example of 3 books stacked on top of each other. And if they were always here stacked on top of each other, then that cause-effect relationship would always be happening. He's explaining per se versus per accident as causal relationships in that. So, with Lewis, I think, he definitely has some lingering Thomist tendencies in him. But I would say some of the main things that he's talking about, which he treats very briefly, I think some of the main things that he's talking about, he's trying to lean into the things that could be said without offense, right, so to speak, in the West. But, certainly the causal stuff, he's doing something that's very, very Eastern and very Nicene. Yeah. Yeah.
Hello. Earlier, you gave examples or definitions of different types of causes.
Yeah.
And the language you use for the Son being the only begotten, the language of the Spirit being precedes or outbreathed, like you said.
Mm-hmm.
I guess, what is the difference between those 2 types of causes? Are they the same type because they result in 2 persons with the same divine essence and nature?
Yeah. The answer is no, they're not the same because one is only begotten, right? Mm-hmm. This is one of the justifications in the Latin scholastics to try to, like Thomas Aquinas, to try to differentiate, like to say the dual procession, the Spirit proceeding from the Father and the Son, is the thing that's required to make it a distinct mode of cause, right? And so that's one of the cases for the filioque that emerges in medieval scholastics. Eastern Fathers are fine with just leaving it at the biblical language and saying, I don't know, I can breathe I can cause breath to cast on the air, and that's very different than begetting somebody. How that's different, that's where they're like, I don't know, that's beyond our understanding. Now, let me just say something about. Absolutely. That's so, no, but one of the things that I would just say here is I just want to give a little bit of an aside on mystery, because I used that term earlier when I said some people are like, we don't know. The Trinity is just a mystery, right? First of all, the word mystery doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean I know not what. Actually, mystery, historically speaking, means things that were hidden that we now understand is actually what mystery is meant. So it comes from the verb muin, which means to shut. And that verb ends up being utilized to talk about like mystikos, mystical one, which would be terms for somebody who's been initiated into a mystery cult. Because the initiation would involve the shutting of the eyes or the shutting of the mouth. And then that becomes, when you're talking about mysteries, then after that, you're talking about these things that the initiated or newly illumined, those of you who are Orthodox and have seen people been baptized, chrismated, you're the newly illumined. People like Philo of Alexandria say, having been illumined, you now understand things, right? Before you read these Old Testament stories and you're like, I don't know, they're talking about giants and floods and all sorts of craziness. I don't know what's going on. And then Christ shows up and you're like, oh, it all makes sense. Right? Because now these things that were veiled and unclear, the substance has arrived and you now understand them. So that's what mystery actually means. It's horribly abused because people use it to say like, I don't know. It's a mystery. Fascinates. And so I don't want to use it in that way ever. And I will say also, and I did a whole episode on misunderstanding mystery in my podcast. Well, I'll just say that there's a reason why the Eastern Fathers say it's not just because it's a hard question that they say it's beyond our understanding, but it's because what they recognize is that our understanding, the way the human mind works, is you work in terms of forms. You think in terms of pictures. So when you think of an object, you think in terms of, what color is it? What size is it? Where is it? Does it have sides? Is it round? Is it this? Is it that? And you think in pictures, right? Like you think in forms. But reality is more than forms. And that's their point, is that there are things in reality that are not forms. There are things that are lower than forms, right? Like their concept of matter is that it's pure potentiality, so it has no concrete structure unto itself. Well, that means you can't think of it. Because if you thought of it, you'd think of it with properties. It doesn't have any of those, right? And then there's things that are above form, like God. And you can't think of that either because your mind's like, well, I want to draw a line around it. And it's like, well, you can't, right? And so just like with matter, the mind gets frustrated. And that's one of the reasons why they want to insist that when you're talking about reason, these sort of rational abstractions, they deal in a limited range of reality of necessity because reality is more than forms. And so that's one of the reasons why they would say analogically, we can talk about begetting. God's given us an analogy to think of. You know what it means to beget. And now we've got to add all our qualifications. It's eternal. It doesn't involve secretion, separation, all that. And similar without breathing. And it's just meant to tell you these are two different types of causation. The result is two different hypostases of a common nature with the Father. And beyond that, we don't really know much. Yeah.
So, kind of connected to the last one, I was about to say not really to the purview of the talk, but I think it is.
Okay.
Now that you said. So, a lot of these heresies, they're sticky. They stick to our being or loose. And I'm wondering, can you give some examples and some practical effects of holding to these, maybe even subconsciously?
Yeah.
In our repentance.
Yeah. I think one of the main things that happens with people in terms of some of these heresies, I think the Sabellianism and the monotheism thing, again, we're monotheists, but not in the way a modernist thinks of monotheism. I think one of the ways it comes out is I think, for example, of, so as to not cause any embarrassment, should this go on the internet, I won't name any names, but I think of certain relatives that I know, right? Who sort of have a little bit of hand-wringing about the Trinity because they're like, I don't know. It's like, there's like three of them, but there's one God, and I don't know what that means. And we'll actually ask, like, am I supposed to be talking to the Father or the Son? Like, should I address all three at once? Like, I don't know. I don't know what to do. And it creates this weird practical anxiety about thinking that they're not actually distinct persons, as opposed to what you find in, the actual rote prayers where they do address God the Father, or they do address the Son, or they do address the Spirit, right? And so I think coming to grips with the fact that saying yes, okay, there is a difference between, three human persons and God, right? We can go through all the bodily stuff. We can go through all that. But it's okay to recognize that they're distinct, the way the hymnody does, the way Scripture does, the way prayer does, and to relate them to them as such. And yet at the same time, recognizing that there's a harmony, right? This is something where certain other types of doctrines that would be very alien to the East come out, like penal substitution. And so sometimes there's a tendency within that context to see like a difference between the persons. Like the Father is really mad and the Son's really, I've actually heard people say, like, I'm very comfortable with Jesus. I like Jesus. I really wish the Father was more like Jesus. which is a really wild thing to say. That's not a character. I've heard it, right? And we can, and I know that sophisticated advocates of penal substitution wouldn't say that, and they say that that's a distortion, but it's still one of those things that comes through when there's sort of this failure to see that if you've seen me, you've seen the Father, right? Failure to see that Christ is the clearest manifestation that you have of what God is really like. That is the revelation. He is the icon of the invisible God. Those sorts of things. So those are a couple of areas where I'd say, the older heresies, they outright. Yes.
So as Christians, when we read the Old Testament, we'll see the Holy Trinity, days, God. So I guess the question is for were there Jews or Hebrews who had an inkling of of the Holy Trinity, or was this some sort of breakback in revelation? Obviously, many Jews did believe and convert to Christ, and by definition.
Yeah, the answer is yes. There were Jews who thought about it. You probably primarily have to look to Alexandrian Judaism. So Alexandrian Judaism was, again, Eastern Judaism. We don't have a ton. I mean, we've got Philo, and that's pretty much most of what we have. I mean, beyond Philo, we have some scattered letters and things like that. But most of what we rely on for Alexandrian Judaism is Philo. But Philo is amazing. Philo is absolutely amazing. You're like, I don't know what angel this guy was talking to, but like that dude knows some stuff.
Yeah.
And Philo, what's that?
What are you?
Oh, he's overlapping. I mean, he's a contemporary. I mean, you're talking about in the first century, he's actually being echoed by people like Paul. So he's right in that sort of like transitional period into the New Testament. And it's extraordinary the things that you find in Philo is that with Philo, when you're looking at him, he's first of all recognizing that within wisdom literature, there's the second subject of wisdom that's showing up through whom God is creating the world. Okay. And the thing is that I know that people who maybe have only read, sort of the Protestant canon are only familiar with Proverbs, but that's in all of the wisdom literature. That character always shows up. It's consistent. And it's extraordinary what it's said, right? I think it's is it in Wisdom of Solomon where I think it is where it's referred to, wisdom is referred to as begotten. It's God's only begotten. And then also talk about the energies that proceed from wisdom and things like that. And because of this recognition of this distinction between God and his wisdom, there was a tendency to talk about wisdom or the logos in Philo. He would also use the logos because this was just by way of background. A lot of the pagans early on are already having this discussion about, is the world ordered by something like a mind? And they used several different words. They used nous, mind, right? Philetus, love. They used wisdom, right? They used logos, word. And so the Jews were part of that conversation. Right? And they're like, yeah, we believe in providence. We believe it's ordered by something like mind. So Philo would talk about the wisdom God order. It's logos. And he actually refers to the logos as deuteros theos, second God. And speculates that maybe since we are models, maybe we as images of God are logos-bearing animals who are modeled after the logos. And maybe for that reason, he'll be the one who becomes incarnate and establishes the royal priesthood and things like that. So Philo's attuned to a few different things about what's possible. So you do have this multiplicity, and that's not just in the Jews. It's also there in the pagans, right? You already have Platonists are speculating about God, who is the one who then generates the nous, the mind that orders all things, which the forms are, and then the world soul. And those were referred to as hypostases. That was another place where the term hypostasis is referred to, the three hypostases of the one, right? The one, the nous, and the world soul. And so this was just a general conversation the Jews and the Christians were all involved in. And I'm convinced, even though people don't like to utilize people like Philo in New Testament studies, I don't really care. I'm convinced Philo is probably the background for a lot of what you find in the New Testament. I mean, Paul is clearly citing Alexandrian Genesis commentaries when he's saying things like, you've been made in the image of earth, man, you need to be remade in the image of the man of heaven, and things like that. So I presume that John's prologue, for example, is playing on existing Alexandrian sentiments about the logos.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's apologize. It's going to be a very poorly formulated question.
No.
Okay, so thinking about the sort of early Christian heresies and the problem is the early church fathers were trying to solve. It seems like
one of the issues was, the pagan perception that divinity was this constantly disseminating, this constant disseminating whatever means that create further and further and further gods. And that seems to be one of the issues they would deal with.
Yep.
I look at the world today, and it seems like we're in a world of increasing confusion with regards to the nature of God, to say the least. It seems it's hard for me not to see the sort of the history of Western philosophy as sort of an attempt to commit the equal and opposite issue of kind of trying to go beyond this Trinitarian conceptualizations. You were talking about, this almost existence essence qualification within the West. There's sort of this attempt to go beyond Trinitarianism, if you will. Can we see the history of kind of modern philosophy as we've experienced it as sort of a repaganization, sort of in an equal and opposite extreme? Is that a fair look?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Yeah, I mean, so what I do wonder if in some ways that is interesting, right? It's an interesting thought to consider whether or not whether modernity is basically the pendulum swing of that. It's perfect being theology made manifest and like followed all the way through to its logical conclusion, and post-modernity is a repaganization. That's an interesting thought. And I think it's interesting because I really do see modern philosophy as the culmination of perfect theology. I think that's where religious pluralism comes from. I think that's where rational religion comes from. So all the systems of Leibniz and Spinoza within modernity, I think, are just an outgrowth of, perfect being theology. Even though Spinoza, and forgive me if people don't know who any of these people are, right? But these are the rationalists, right? So in modernity, the rationalists who think everything is all about like abstract a priori reason. We can discern the structure of reality from that. The two sort of chieftains of that, if you will, are Leibniz and Spinoza. And Spinoza is the one who, Leibniz is at least trying to preserve some form of Christianity. He's trying to preserve free will. Spinoza is the guy who just bites the bullet and is like, yeah, God is absolutely, he starts with the ontological argument from Anselm, and then he advocates for it, and then he says, and for that reason, God is the only real substance, and we are just sort of accidental traits of that substance, and there is no free will, and everything that happens is absolute necessity, and so on. And he just plays it out into a logical system of complete and total analytic rational necessity, right? And I think in some ways that's the logical end of the rationalist project. It's also the logical end of perfect being theology, from what I can tell, where there is a collapsing initially of personhood and nature, and then that works its way out into a collapsing of will, and that works its way out then into a collapsing of God and creatures totally, where you have a pantheism of necessity, which is what you have in Spinoza. But what's interesting in people once you have the resistance to that, and I would identify the resistance primarily the sort of the seeds of postmodernity, and that resistance is coming out of the leftist Hegelians. So the form of pantheism that's working in modernity ends up being culminated in Hegel's system of pantheism. He still wants to talk about contingency and freedom, but it's questionable what he means. And then you get leftist Hegelians who are like, we like this system. It explains everything. Let's just get rid of the God part. And that's where you get Feuerbach and then Karl Marx. Right? Heard of him. And now all of a sudden, everything just is, it's a system of dialectical development pushing forward, but revolution is the primary development, and it's not God doing it, it's man doing it, right? That's the Marxist version of this. I think the thing that's interesting is somebody like Nietzsche is sort of the right version of that. If you're going to do right left, right? Nietzsche is like, no, it's the will to power. It's the Übermensch, right? Like, you should not be ashamed of your power, and you should crush the skulls of the weak, and you get like a proto-Nazism in Nietzsche. What's interesting is Nietzsche, for all of his contempt for Christianity, he really liked pagan polytheism. Like, he thought that's great, right? And because he thought it was a truer religion, truer to the nature of reality, which is just a power struggle. And there is something true about that, right? If you look at ancient, sort of like Homeric, if you go back, like in, like Homer and Hesiod and things like that, you really don't have a concept that gods are good and evil. There are guys and your guys. They're just in conflict, right? And religion was primarily devotion to a deity. It wasn't primarily about virtue, right? It was primarily about utility. And so that's why Nietzsche loves it, because it is just a power struggle. And so I'm looking for whose team I want to be on, in terms of that with gods. So it is interesting, though, that I think the rise of the sort of neo-paganism that we're seeing right now, that might be the logical outgrowth of the fracturing of monotheism into, if the human spirit, which I'm convinced it can't be truly nihilistic, materialist atheists, and that religious impulse is going to emerge, but you're in a completely relativistic, hedonistic context, then some form of neo-paganism is bound to resurface with that. Yeah, interesting quote. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
All right. So, given all that you've shared tonight, there's stark differences between East and West when it comes to Trinitarian theology and also other things.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on the fact that the East, the West, and there's this kind of hope of the East and the West emerging clearly? Is that just what is that, Penny?
The first thing I would recommend is that you hurry over to the eastwestseries.com.
I was going to say
You pre-order the 25-part lecture series.
So, yeah, it's every year I feel like every year there's a picture of Pope and return to the East. It's like, oh man, there's a unity. It's like, well, what we're seeing is like there's not much unity.
Yeah. I'll just say very quickly, I'm very cynical about that stuff. I mean, I think the divides are far too deep. I look with the filioque and things like that. When people try to say, well, I think we could reconcile it in this way if we say it that way, I think what they're ignoring is that if we dig down beneath the filioque, there are foundational differences about the Trinity. These passages you're talking about in the Church Fathers and how you're reading them is the last flicker. That's the end of the discussion. The beginning is way back earlier. And so, yeah, I think they're cosmically different, and I think they're truthfully irreconcilable. That's my honest take. But there you go.
Great way to end.
Wow.
The Christian East and the Christian West share the same creed, the same scriptures, and yet they are worlds apart. The differences run deeper than Mary or icons or liturgy, going to the very nature of God, the hope of salvation, and even what it means to be human. They use the same words, but their meanings could not be more different. As these two worlds collide in our contemporary culture, what's needed is a translator. I spent nearly 2 decades studying these two traditions, devoting myself to figures like Augustine, Aquinas, and the Reformers in the West, but finding myself crossing the threshold of the Eastern Orthodox Church. And now, I'm producing a 25-part lecture series to help bridge this gap, exploring the differences between Eastern and Western Christianity. Pre-order the series now at the lowest price that will ever be offered, or support my efforts by becoming a series producer at theeastwestseries.com. That's theeastwestseries.com. Hey everybody, thanks for watching, thanks for listening. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. Go ahead and hit that bell if there is a bell, and leave a comment. I hear that's great for the algorithm, and also like it and tell your friends. I really appreciate your support, and until next time.